No question, California Republicans have their work cut out for them. Their share of registered voters is shrinking, now less than 30%. They hold no statewide offices and have minimal power in Sacramento. The party's new chair, former State Senator Jim Brulte, is rebuilding the GOP from the ground up, a job he says could take up to a decade. Joining me now to discuss what challenges are ahead for the Republican Party in California are GOP strategist Hector Barajas and Scott Detrow, Sacramento bureau chief for KQED. He's covering the convention in Burlingame this weekend. And Scott Detrow, what do the Republicans need and hope to accomplish at their convention this weekend?
These conventions are really important to energize the base, to get the party activists really amped up for the upcoming election. Hector would probably agree with me that sometimes it's a little discouraging to be a Republican in California. So I think what the Republican leaders want to do here is hit pause and say, hey guys, let's take a look back. We've had a pretty successful year. Obviously, we haven't, gotten to the point where we're going to retake the governorship and get a majority in the legislature, but they've paid off a massive debt. They've won some important special elections like the San Diego mayor's race, and they feel like they have a good chance to pick off some congressional seats.
Hector, what would you add to that?
Everything's about going back to basics. It's making sure that we are out there fundraising. And I think Scott is right in the sense of we have paid off a very large debt. But it's also about recruiting candidates, and that's where we've been spending this past 6-7 months, recruiting the candidates, making sure they're out there raising money, and at the same time building nice grassroots operations that we can really plug into as we go into the general election.
What's the toughest part of recruiting candidates in this climate?
It's making sure that we recruit the right candidates for the districts. Obviously, we've got a lot of districts where there's a lot more Latino voters, and it's making sure that we get those Latino candidates in those areas, people who understand what it's like to run for office. If you don't have them running for lower office and then moving them up, that becomes very difficult because you've now put them into an assembly seat or race that's going to be very difficult for them.
And you're saying so that ideally you should be getting more Latinos to run for office as Republicans? That's sort of obvious, I guess. Yeah,
in a lot of the districts. I mean, we have some districts, for example, in the Central Valley, where we have about a 65% registered Latino population. We should try to, the big part of what we're trying to do is match candidates up to the districts.
And Scott Detrow, Democrats have a supermajority up in Sacramento in the Assembly. The one in the Senate slipped away because of these scandals. What are they focusing on, the Democrats, in terms of getting that back? Where are the key races that we should be looking at and that both parties are really focusing on come November?
Well, you need to look in the Central Valley and you need to look in Orange County. There's a couple races in Orange County that Democrats, there's one who's leaving a Senate seat, so it's a vacant Senate seat, and there's an Assembly race that Republicans feel like they can pick off. So it's a handful of races there and also in the Central Valley that I think this is going to come down to. And then there's a whole separate conversation about congressional races. I mean, partially because of the way that California has drawn its districts, there were several races, Ami Bera, in the Sacramento area that were won 51-49 last time around. So I think that's where
in a presidential year.
In a presidential year. So yeah, now you have an off-year election where the out-of-power party typically does pretty well. In the 6th year of a presidency especially, I think Republicans feel like they can gain 2, maybe 3 congressional seats.
Hector, it's been 20 years since Prop 187 was on the ballot. Pete Wilson won re-election that year, and it was really in many ways the beginning of the decline for the Republican Party. How big of an impact did that have on your party and on the Latino community?
Not only how much did it have, but it still has. Because I remember being in high school and having to see the Proposition 187. I was born in the United States, my parents weren't, but at the same time, I was worried, am I going to get deported? Does it affect me? And I think you have a lot of Latinos for 1 or 2 generations who still feel that way. And at the same time, it did hurt the party. And we have been slowly rebuilding. And part of that rebuilding has been to try to focus on getting people elected to local office who look like that community, a lot of Latinos.
And I think that's where you're going to see a divide at the convention this weekend, where you have the top of the ticket, the governor's race. You have 2 candidates, one Neil Kashkari, the other is Assemblyman Tim Donnelly, who really made a name for himself on the immigration issue. Really,
he was the co-founder of the Minutemen.
Exactly,
standing at the border with rifles.
Yeah, he tried to repeal the DREAM Act here in California. So he's someone who's closely associated with those types of efforts. And I think a lot of Republicans are concerned that if he ends up in the fall election going up against Governor Brown, that's hard for the party to kind of get over this hump that they've been trying to do for a while now.
And then you've got Neil Kashkari, who is a son of immigrants, immigrated here from India. and at the same time was, became an aerospace engineer, later on worked in the financial industry and did quite well for himself. And so, yeah, you do have a good contrast there between two individuals.
You look back 4 years ago, Meg Whitman was the Republican nominee for governor. Carly Fiorina from HP was the head of the party for the Senate, running against Barbara Boxer. They both lost. What were the lessons learned for the party from those two races?
Obviously, money can't buy you an election. Money isn't everything. You've got to build a nice grassroots operation, and you've got to have that thing going on year after year after year. I think one of the things that we look at is a campaign apparatus that begins and ends 4 or 5 months before an election, and once the election's over with, then you've got to start it all over again. And you start going to some of these communities, and when you've been absent for about 6, 7, 8 months, it's very difficult. I think the lesson that we learned from the Democratic Party is they have an ongoing election cycle going over and over every single month, and that's what we've started to do.
The fastest growing segment of the electorate are declined estate voters, not Republicans, not Democrats. What are each of the parties doing to appeal to those voters, Scott?
Well, I think one thing that Republicans, when I interviewed Tim Donnelly before, he tries to cast aside the long track record he's developed on these social issues. And he said, it's not about social issues. I need to talk about financial issues, because I think, when you talk about the fact that you need to lower taxes, you need to improve the economy. Neil Kashkari's talking a lot about focusing on fighting poverty. I think financial issues, quality of life issues are something that everybody can relate to. Nobody wants to pay more taxes than they have to. Everybody wants to make more money.
And maybe, Hector, more of a libertarian point of view on things like gay marriage and abortion?
More libertarian, but also it's got to be a message of opportunity for all Californians. We may have been out of this recession, or at least the governor likes to say we're out of this recession, but there are a lot of people hurting. There's still a lot of people who are underemployed and also unemployed. And so we've got to be able to provide that opportunity. As you all have been discussing, we have a drought situation in California. We have a Central Valley that may hit, again, at to 40% unemployment rate. What's going to happen to those individuals at the same time? What's going to happen to food prices when we go into the market?
When you walk through that convention hall this weekend, do you expect to see people who look like you, Latinos, Asians, African Americans, or more white folks, the kind of face of the party that has really been the face of the party since Ronald Reagan and before?
I expect to see a lot more Latinos. We elected 48 Latinos and Latinas to local office over the last year. They're going to be at the convention, and we've got 80 races that we're running this year, and they're going to be at the convention too. And
so you think that that's been accomplished, or how much work is there still to do?
We've always said it's about a 6 to 8 year process on our end with Grow Elect, and we're going to continue to work toward that goal to try to get more Latinos and Latinas. We know the Asian community is doing the same thing with some similar type of program, and so we're starting to see a lot more diversity, but there's still a long way to go.
All right, Hector Barajas, Scott Detrow, thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you.
Thanks.